We are going to have Deuce, the Magic Man, Bennett, and Jen Hachigian to give us a great demonstration of spline control in 11.6. Guys, take it away.
Hi. My name is Jennifer Hachigian, and I'd like to introduce you to a new feature in 11.6 called Spline Control. What this does is it will use a virtual spline to define a path, and then you can either animate objects along that path or use it to deform a chain of objects, or both. So first I'm going to build my virtual spline. I'm going to add a null object, and that's going to be the master parent that contains my spline. And then I'm going to clone it a couple times. I'm just going to create 4 children, parent it to this null.
So do you have to use nulls, or can you use anything?
Oh, you can use any item whatsoever. I could have done this out of lights, cameras, but then that would have affected the look of my scene. So I decided to use nulls in this case. It could be objects, but again, it's just most convenient to use nulls. And so I've got this null, and I'm going to space these along the z-axis, so I've got a straight line. So I've got a chain of nulls, 1, 2, 3, 4. And I've got 4 nulls in a row. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell the camera that I want spline control to be this null that contains these children. And all of a sudden, the null is now represented by a spline. The look of the spline can be controlled in the display panel. Go to the GL tab, and you can show the spline controls as a curve, as a ribbon. Only a curve when it's actually selected.
So the spline looks more like a curve. It's basically the same kind of thing, yes?
Yes, like the best is the default where if you have it selected, it's a curve, or you have it as a ribbon, and if it's not selected at all, if you have another object in the scene, and you select that, it'll be displayed as lines. So when it or its children are selected, you see the ribbon, and that's my favorite, and that is the default.
So here you've told the camera to use this spline for something, but what is it now going to do?
Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to animate its Z position. If I set it to 0 at frame 0, that puts it at the head of the spline. If the Z position is now going to be mapped to the distance traveled along the spline. So I'm going to animate the Z to go over here at frame 120. And right now it doesn't seem like much, except that it really is under control of this spline. So if I were to start shifting these around so that it takes more of a curve, then the camera now follows the track. And let me zoom in there.
So as you're doing these with nulls, I'm just assuming here that you can actually animate those nulls over time as well.
Oh, absolutely. So if you're doing a collapsing roller coaster, then you can do that by just animating these nulls over time and change the path over time. You can also control the twist of the spline, which is represented by this ribbon, by banking. So rotate each null on its bank to control the twist.
So I remember there was a similar kind of a control like this already in LightWave, that when you hit the end of the spline or the beginning of the spline, that was the end of the motion. Is that still the same case in this?
Oh, in this case, it will go on to infinity and beyond. So if you animate the Z position so that it exceeds the distance of the spline, then the camera is just going to go on forever. What I also like to show you is that you can use the same spline for multiple items. So if you're chasing a spaceship down this spline, you could tell this null, hey, I'd like you to use this spline control as well. And let me give this a custom object. Let's go to item shape, make it a ball, and make it a little bit smaller, so that now I've got a ball representation. So I'll have it start out ahead of the camera. So if you're following a plane, an airplane, for example, you can now have the same path can control both the camera and the object that are animating along this path. So in this case, I've got this ball. I'll make it green.
So once you set up a spline, you don't have to just use one object. You can have it can actually control multiple objects.
Yep, so you can have as many objects as you want following along the spline with the Z position animating, representing the distance traveled along the spline. So if you have 0 on the Z axis, then that means a 0 distance on the spline. And you can also envelope the speed just using the graph editor on the Z channel. So there's not much to it, although I should show you what happens when you have parented chains. That's a big one. Because let me take this null object,
Well, so what if you were to right now, what if you were to animate that head null, the one that you've got that's red? What happens to the spline?
The entire spline will move. I should mention that, is that if you move the parent, the master parent that represents the spline, you're moving the spline itself. So what I'd like to show you is what happens when you have a chain of items, each with a slight Z offset. Now in this case, all of them have the spline control applied to them. If I have it set to none, actually let me zero out the X and Y so that you see a straight chain, and also let me zero out the rotation that they had. So what you see here is a straight chain that when you move it on the Z, when you move the parent on the Z, all of its children have to go for a ride with it. It has no choice. And that's still the same thing when you tell all of them, fine, move on the Z, but I want you to represent the Z as the distance traveled along this spline. They're cool with that. It's just, and they will still move as a unit.
Well, this is starting to look a little bit like a roller coaster or
Well, a
a
collapsing roller
train or
coaster.
something.
So the rules of parenting haven't changed. The parent still pushes its kids around. It's just that the kids' motions are now constrained to the spline. Another thing I want to point out is, again, if you move the child, it won't affect the parent. So this kid has a kid parented to it, so it's all of a sudden going off in the distance there. And that's no different than if all these guys were no different than if these guys were not controlled by the spline. It's the kids can't.
Okay,
move
so
their
this
parent.
is kind of interesting. So what I'm seeing now is I'm seeing that you can create a shape, you can create a spline with this, and you can control the handles. Is there any additional way that I can control those handles? Like, say, maybe with other handles, or maybe even a displacement?
Oh, I see what you mean. Yes, if you mean like using follower to push the chain down the spline, or
Yeah, or
Absolutely.
I'm thinking too that one of the things that a lot of people have initially thought about with the spline is like a spline AK for dealing with tails and such. But as an animator, I always want to have as few controls as possible to get a more of a smooth motion. So what kind of control options do I have as far as controlling these the knots on the spline?
Let's see. Regarding like whips and tails, if you leave the root item zeroed out on the Z so that it's on the root of the Z axis, then all of a sudden, like these guys, what you're looking at is just the animation of the nodes themselves. So in this case, you're only looking at the distortion that's done to the chain itself. You're not seeing the chain's no longer acting like a train or a snake going down a path. It's just about the deformation done to the chain
this
itself.
seems more like you would want to be bones instead of nulls.
Yes, let me actually do that right now. Let me get a bone chain in there. Select these bones, hit M for motion, go to spline control, and choose that spline. And that's it.
So this one spline, you've actually got controlling some null objects, you've got them controlling the camera, you've also got them controlling some bones.
Yep. Let me delete those keys, move these guys down a bit, give them a little more space. there's another nice bit here is that because all it's doing is it's looking at this item and looking at its children, you can extend the spline by cloning the last kid and just moving him down. So it's easy to extend the spline just by adding more children to it.
So if you needed to add some additional controls because of a given scene or a given need, you don't have to start all over again. You can just extend it out.
Yep. So there you go.
So it's looking like the bones. What are the bones doing here? Like the head and the tip is following the actual spline itself.
Yes, because the children have to be locked to the parent. The parent is not budging from the root here. Let me hide these just so we can get a good look at these guys. Because this guy is zeroed out on the Z, he's going to be locked to the root of this spline. So but these guys, what they're doing is
Do you have something maybe like I saw you working once on like an organic kind of an octopus kind of a thing. This is really starting to feel like tendrils or tentacles or something.
Yep, I've got that right here. So this was an example a much more practical example of how I would use Spline IK. In this case,
yeah.
I've got 8 tentacles, and they're using the exact same tool that I showed you, except that in this case I've put a little more thought into it. So what you have is 8 tentacle chains, and each chain is referencing a different spline. In this case, spline 1. This tentacle, it's referencing spline 2. And in what I did with the nodes on this one is I used the same as item, each of the nodes on these splines.
So what it looks like you've done here is it looks like you've got an awful lot of control points for your spline, so it's going to be smooth, but then you've reduced the number of actual controls that you as an animator have to work with.
Yes, when I worked on Armageddon, we had to do all these nodloids, and so what I did for the rigs on that one, was I set it up this way, where the control points would be rings that would in turn be parented to a single central parent. So that way, with moving one object, with scaling one object, with rotating one object, I could get something that looked complicated, but then I still had the freedom to go into an individual control and tweak an individual tentacle.
So it's a layered approach.
Yes, it's better to have something generic that you can then refine over time. So it was better to just approach it from that standpoint. So that's why in this scene that you're looking at now, it looks complicated, but it's really just 4 objects that are being animated total, just these 4 masters. All they're doing is bouncing up and down, scaling, and their child nulls are forced to go for a ride.
Do you have any other samples of something like following like maybe a snake or a train or something?
Yes, I do. So in this case, the only animation going on is all of these guys are referencing the spline null, this spline null as their spline target. It's looking at these node objects, these null objects, as the nodes on the spline. It's drawing the spline from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. Let me go backwards. That's 8, 7, 6, 5. And the head of the spline, right here, that's the only, the head of the bone chain right here, that's the only object that has any animation. And if you look at its graph editor, it's the Z position that's being animated.
So you're just moving, you move one thing, that sets the speed, the spline sets the slither.
Yep, because if you didn't have spline control applied to all these bones, then the snake would just be forced to, if you took it off, then this is what you get, is you just get a straight motion.
For those of you who can't see, that's 71 bones. I don't think I'd want to have to hand animate that.
It was a long snake. So but once you apply spline control, it translates that movement, makes it conform to this spline. So now it takes the spline's path. So if you were to adjust this spline, you would be adjusting the snake's path.
Okay, so far everything we've seen has been straight splines. So we've got a spline that starts and a spline that ends. Is there any way of making a loop?
Oh, yes. So in this example, I've got two cameras. One's going on a loop, and the other one's just flying away.
So I'm guessing it's just an option that you set to close it up?
Yep. There are two separate virtual splines in this scene. So what you do is you go to the object that's being referred to by the camera as a spline object. You go to its motion options, you go to controllers and limits, and right there's an option to make the spline closed. If it's closed, then the camera will continue to loop around the track. If it's open, once it's reached the end of the spline, then it'll just keep on going.
Okay, well this is starting to make me think about things like bicycle chains or tank treads.
Good thing you mentioned those. So this is a little more complicated because I've got, in this example, I have a bone chain, and the bone chain is following this spline. So I also have follower applied to both the root of the chain, and what it does is it follows the large sprocket so that at any point in the animation I can interactively adjust the rotation, and that affects the Z position of the root of the chain, which in turn pushes this along the spline.
So if you've got any nodes like along that bottom, along the bottom of that chain, you could maybe even give a little bit of vibration, a little bit of up and down in that.
Yep. So you can just do that by animating them and. So
okay, this would be kind of hard without this tool. I'm starting to think about, dynamic simulations and such.
Anything's possible. So if you go to this situation, what you have is a bunch of boxes that are, again, they're following a spline, and the nodes of the spline are animated, which means that since they're following
so this
the
is
track,
looking like tank treads.
Yep. And again, what you have here is you have a hierarchy of objects that represent the nodes of a spline, and then you have these items who in turn are referencing the master parent as the spline that will control their motion, which will
Does this work with instancing as well?
Yes, it does. In this situation, what I've got is I've got a bone chain that drives a bunch of short-edged 4-point polygons that I refer to as the instance container. And then what I have is I have a bunch of instances, and I tell them align to the shortest side of the polygon. So that's what I've got.
There's one other item that kind of makes me think about our ArchViz guys, who might have to do something like, what is that people mover thing?
I know what you mean. Now I'll show you what this one's doing. It's the exact same thing that you saw in the tank tread scene. It's the exact same thing that you saw. It's the exact same thing that you saw in the.
Okay, so wait a minute. I see one main difference about this than the tank, and that's that the item that's following the spline isn't actually rotating with it. It's staying it's staying up and down. Is this a...
Yes, this is not, I'll show you what happens. When you apply, let me take the spline control off. So all you see is a chain of objects with the parent pushing them like a bunch of shopping carts down the Z position. When you apply spline control for the first time, it will override the XYZ and the HPV, the position and rotation channels, all at once. You can go in and interactively set the rotation back to keyframes, at which point all that it's affecting is the XYZ position.
So now it's just doing position, so you can actually have it affect one without the other. You can separate.
Yep, and so you get the look that you need for an example, this escalator scene. So that's
okay,
what I'd like to bring.
That's kind of nice.
Yep. So there's not much to it. What you do is, oh gosh, there are some little things I should probably cover, and you'll find this in the 11.6 content in your accounts.
Yeah. So are we getting all these bits of content when we get 11.6 so that we can jump right into using spline control?
Absolutely. This content is meant to walk you through the nature of this spline because it's a virtual spline. One of the points that I make on it is that you can't use it to. You can use it as a motion controller specifically. That's what it's for. And the next thing that I bring up is I want to make sure that people know that all that matters is hierarchy. Naming conventions don't matter, which is why in this example scene I have them named ridiculous names. Hot dog, hamburger, pizza. Naming conventions do not matter. Only item order, cheeseburger, 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 Pepsi.
Okay, I see way too many cheeseburgers. You're making me hungry now.
This one I want to bring up because it's not something that you might necessarily use, but when you do a spline setup, in this case, I've got a hierarchy, a more complex hierarchy that's being used for my spline. But what you're looking at here is it's only going after those items that have no children of their own. Anything that has a child is ignored. And what this means is that you have the option of creating a level of puppet controls within your spline itself, within your spline hierarchy.
So this is how you added that additional control for that big octopus thing.
Well, that one was more complex. Those were external controls using same as item. That was external. That was more about external
But
controls.
still, it's giving you that flexibility that once you know that it only uses the childless, anything you set up before that is going to become a handle. It's going to become a control point.
Yep. I don't recommend it, but this is an example of doing a sloppy spline where you just have a null, a ball, a light, camera. They're all in there, and it doesn't care. It'll just draw a line from start to finish. It'll draw a virtual spline through the children. This one was more about what I covered earlier about the importance of being able to twist the spline.
So this looks like it's really giving you a lot more control. I mean, certainly some of these movements that you're doing with just the camera, you could just keyframe with the camera. Mm-hmm. But it's giving you a lot more control and a lot more visual aspects of being able to get in the banks, the bends, the...
Oh yeah, and also one last tip. If you aren't sure whether or not you want one of these nodes to be considered part of the spline, you can turn it on and off by checking it and unchecking it in the scene editor. That way, if you're not sure whether or not you want to draw a spline through those objects, you can just uncheck them in the scene editor, and if you decide, well, you really did want those back in, you can add them back in by just checking them in the scene editor.
That's pretty handy.
Yeah, the tool's really simple. It's like parenting. So it's like but there's all these nice little bits in the tool that I just figured I should point out during this presentation. For example, the important thing is that with items that have a pivot point, but nothing else than that, they're always going to be tangent to the spline. But bones will never be tangent to the spline. What it does is it respects the rest length of that spline.
So it's actually reading the head and the tail. Whereas
Yes.
everything else is just going to read like the pivot point.
Both ends of the bone will rest on the spline. So that's what I'd like to emphasize there, is that if you need your items to be tangent at all times, their pivots to be tangent, nulls would be a great choice. If you need to create a chain where it appears that each pivot is attached to the spline, I recommend bones, because the tip will just go nicely onto the spline where the next bone might be. So it looks like their pivots it looks like more of a train here, but it's really just the nature of the bone itself.
So this looks like yet another one of those tools that the LightWave group has added into LightWave 11.6 that makes it easier for a single person working in a small studio to not necessarily need to have a dedicated team as a technical director. I mean, the tools are there and are made easy to use, so that anyone can just jump right in and start doing this.
And here's just a simple example of where I see it getting used a lot. If you'd like to define a path for the camera and then envelope the velocity of the camera along that path, you're welcome to do it with spline control. Just create a virtual spline that's made of nodes, and then tell the camera to reference that spline object, and you'll have a path that you can envelope the camera around.
All right.
Okay.
So that's spline control, spline motion in 11.6. Anyone who owns 11.x, this is free upgrade. It's in your account at www.lightwave3d.com. If you purchase it here at the show or during our show special, this is in pre-release. It'll wind up in your account as well.